The billionaire saw a cleaner identical to his wife, who died 10 years ago, and froze in shock. I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. The rain pounded furiously against the windows of James Richards' office, but he didn't take his eyes off the city sprawling beneath him. From the top of the Richard Tower, Buenos Aires looked small, insignificant, a collection of flickering lights swallowed by the night. It was a view that should have brought him satisfaction, but all he felt was emptiness. 10 years had passed since the tragedy. 10 years since life had ripped away the only thing he had ever truly loved. 10 years spent drowning in wealth, power, and distractions, all in a futile attempt to fill the abyss inside him. He opened the drawer of his desk and pulled out a small, worn photograph. Jessica, laughing on the beach, her dark hair tousled by the wind, her eyes radiant with happiness. Every time he looked at it, time seemed to stop, whispering that her death wasn't real, that somewhere she was still waiting for him. But the illusion shattered when his mind forced him to remember. The burning wreckage of the car, the charred remains, the closed casket he was never allowed to open. An accident, they told him. A tragedy that couldn't be avoided. But James had never believed those words. Something inside him had always whispered that the truth was far more sinister. A knock on the door dragged him back to the present. His assistant, Marcella, peeked in with her usual professionalism. "Mr. Richard, the jet is ready. We depart in an hour." James slammed the drawer shut and rose to his feet. "Let's go." Sipping his whiskey, he stared into the black void of the night, but his mind was chained to the past. Each memory was a blade, slicing deeper. Jessica's laughter in his arms. Jessica sleeping beside him. Jessica pressing a soft kiss to his forehead, promising she would never leave. And then Jessica disappearing into the fire, into the ashes, into a lie that never quite fit. When his plane landed, the humid night air greeted him with the indifference of a city that never sleeps. He checked into the Bellman Hotel, one of the most exclusive in town, where luxury dripped from every surface. His footsteps echoed against the polished marble floors as he walked toward his suite, his mind already focused on the meetings scheduled for the next day. No room for sentiment. Not anymore. And then he saw her. Just a few feet away, a woman in a cleaning uniform was gathering linens from the hallway floor. At first, she was just another faceless figure in the hotel. But then she stood up, and their eyes met. Time stopped. James felt the air abandon his lungs. It was Jessica. Or at least, that's what his mind screamed in that instant. His long-dead heart lurched violently. The same deep, dark eyes. The same delicate curve of her lips. The same face that haunted his dreams. This was impossible. Jessica was dead. He had buried her. Hadn't he? A dry knot formed in his throat as he staggered back. The woman blinked, noticing his reaction, and tilted her head slightly. "Sir, do you need something?" Her voice hit him like a lightning bolt. It wasn't identical. There was something different in her tone, in the way she carried herself. But then he saw it. The scar on her left wrist. A faint, nearly imperceptible line. But he knew it too well. Jessica had always hidden it beneath bracelets and watches. James felt his entire reality crack. "What's your name?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Victoria, sir," she replied with a polite smile, completely unaware of the storm she had just unleashed inside him. Victoria, not Jessica. James felt dizzy, unsteady. This couldn't be real. It made no sense. And yet, the resemblance was too perfect. The scar was in the exact same place. His thoughts collided, logic crumbling under the weight of something unexplainable. Forcing himself to take a step back, he broke eye contact and turned away. Without another word, he walked off. But her face was branded into his mind, burning, refusing to leave. When he reached his suite, he slammed the door shut and leaned against the desk, his breath ragged. This wasn't Jessica. It couldn't be. Could it? And then an even more terrifying thought slithered into his mind. What if everything he believed for the last 10 years had been a lie? With shaking hands, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in a long time. His voice was steady, but beneath it, a barely contained desperation pulsed. "I need you to investigate someone. Her name is Victoria. Find out everything. And find out now." The past he had buried was clawing its way back to the surface. And this time, he wouldn't let it slip away. Before we continue with the story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. James couldn't sleep. No matter how many times he closed his eyes, Victoria's face kept replaying in his mind. Her voice, her gaze, the way her lips curved when she spoke, the impossible detail of the scar on her left wrist. It couldn't be a coincidence. The idea that Jessica had somehow survived the accident was absurd, but something in his gut told him not to dismiss it so easily. He got out of bed, his chest tight, pacing back and forth in his suite. Every time he tried to convince himself that he was imagining things, his mind threw his own words back at him. What if everything I believed these past 10 years was a lie? He grabbed his phone and checked his messages. Nothing yet. His private investigator was the best, but the uncertainty was eating him alive. He needed answers. Now, he left his suite, took the elevator down, and headed straight for the hotel restaurant. The place was buzzing, executives, tourists, businessmen enjoying their breakfasts. But James wasn't there for food. He was there for her. His eyes scanned the room with restless urgency, and then he saw her. Victoria moved effortlessly between tables, clearing plates, smiling politely at guests with the kind of grace that made her blend into the background. To anyone else, she was just another employee. To James, she was a ghost. His muscles tensed at the sight of her. So close, just a few meters away. For an instant, an irrational urge surged inside him to call her by her old name, to test her reaction, to see if any part of her remembered. But he stopped himself. Taking a deep breath, he squared his shoulders and walked toward her, his steps firm and deliberate. When he was close enough, he spoke, keeping his voice composed even as a storm raged inside him. "Victoria, right?" She turned her head, looking at him with mild curiosity. Dark eyes locked onto his. No recognition. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" The polite tone, the relaxed posture. Every detail pointed to a woman who had no idea who he was. But James couldn't accept that. His instincts screamed that there was something hidden beneath her calm exterior. "I'd like to ask you a few questions," he said, keeping his expression unreadable. "If you're not too busy." Victoria hesitated, glancing around, as if searching for an excuse to avoid the conversation. She didn't find one. "All right," she murmured politely. James led her to a secluded table, watching her intently. He was searching for anything, a flicker of recognition, a moment of hesitation. He didn't want to scare her off, but he needed answers. "How long have you worked here?" he asked, his tone casual. "A couple of years," she answered without hesitation. "It's a good job. Helps me stay afloat." "Have you always lived in Rio?" Victoria's brow furrowed slightly, but she answered anyway. "I don't know. I grew up in an orphanage. I have no clear memories of my childhood or my family. So really, I don't have a place to call home." A chill ran down James's spine. Everything was lining up too perfectly. An orphanage. No memories. The same face. The same scar. His thoughts spun violently. If Victoria grew up in an orphanage, then what really happened to Jessica that night? Before he could ask another question, Victoria laughed softly. "Sir, why are you interrogating me like I'm a criminal?" "You just look familiar," James admitted. "That's impossible," she replied with a smile. "We've never met before." James's jaw clenched. "We've never met before." Something about those words unsettled him. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Have you ever had strange dreams? Blurred memories of things you don't understand?" Victoria's smile faded. Her fingers trembled slightly against the table, but her face remained neutral. "Sometimes," she admitted after a long pause, "dreams about a car, about fire, and someone calling me by a name I don't recognize." James felt the blood drain from his face. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He grabbed it instantly. A message flashed on the screen. His private investigator. "Mr. Richard, we found something strange in Victoria's records. I don't think her existence is a coincidence. We need to talk. Now." His chest tightened. He looked at Victoria one last time, memorizing every detail of her face. Then, without another word, he stood up and walked away. She watched him leave, confused. But James knew. For the first time in 10 years, his life was about to change forever. James spent the entire night awake, trapped in the image of Victoria. Her existence couldn't be a coincidence. The scar, the gestures, the connection he felt when he saw her, everything screamed that she was tied to his past in a way he didn't yet understand. The only way to get answers was through the investigator. As soon as the first rays of sunlight pierced the horizon, he grabbed his phone and dialed. "What did you find?" His voice was rough from exhaustion and tension. On the other end, the investigator's tone was serious. "Victoria's records are a mess. Inconsistent dates, altered documents. She was abandoned at an orphanage as a baby, but here's the strangest part. There's no trace of her birth. No certificate. It's as if she didn't exist before arriving at the orphanage. James felt a shiver creep down his spine. That's not possible. And there's more, the investigator continued. The date Victoria arrived at the orphanage, 2 weeks after Jessica's accident. The impact hit him like a punch to the chest. His breathing quickened. His fingers clenched tightly around the phone. 2 weeks. The investigator hesitated before revealing the final piece of the puzzle. Mr. Richard, if you want the truth, I suggest you speak to the orphanage director. He was the one who signed Victoria's intake documents. And here's the most curious part. After that, he disappeared. James felt his entire world shift beneath him. He hung up without responding, pressing a hand against the glass window of his suite, staring at the city without really seeing it. His mind was racing. If Victoria had been left at an orphanage right after the accident, what did that mean? Why had no one told him? Why did his wife's records and Victoria's seem intertwined in the shadows of a lie? He couldn't stand still. Grabbing his jacket, he left the hotel, moving with determined steps, ready to get the answers he needed. The orphanage was located in a modest neighborhood, far from the luxury he was accustomed to. The building was old, worn. The walls peeled with age, the rusted gate creaked as he pushed it open. An elderly nun greeted him with a kind smile, but as soon as he mentioned Victoria's name, her expression darkened. Why are you asking about her? Because I need to know who she really is. James's heart pounded in his chest. The nun hesitated, lowering her gaze. That child, she was always different. Her voice softened. She arrived under strange circumstances. We don't know who left her, only that it was a woman, covered in a dark veil, crying. She never said her name, just handed us the baby, and disappeared into the night. A chill ran through James's entire body. What else do you know? The nun hesitated, then pulled out a worn-out envelope from an old wooden drawer. This. She handed it to him. We found it with her. James took it with shaking hands. Carefully, he opened it. Inside was a note, the faded ink barely legible. Protect her. Don't look for her. Her life depends on it. And beside the note, a lock of hair tied with a blue ribbon. James's breath hitched. Jessica's ribbon. His heart pounded violently. Had Jessica left Victoria here? Why? If she had survived the accident, why hadn't she come back to him? Before he could ask any more questions, the nun looked at him with grave seriousness. You're not the first one who's come here asking about her. James's pulse quickened. Who else? Years ago, a man came with the same questions. He seemed dangerous, and when he didn't get what he wanted, the orphanage director vanished days later. A shiver crawled up James's spine. Who was he? The nun shook her head. He never said his name, but there was something about him, about the way he spoke, his confidence. He acted like Victoria belonged to him. James's stomach twisted violently. Daniel. Everything clicked. His brother had always envied him. His success, his marriage to Jessica. Had Daniel been involved in her death? Or worse, her disappearance? He took a slow breath, stood up, and nodded at the nun. Thank you, sister. Mr. Richard. She looked at him with solemn eyes. If you keep searching, be careful. I have a feeling there are people who don't want you to uncover the truth. James nodded and walked out of the orphanage, the old envelope tucked safely into his pocket. But as he reached his car, he felt a presence behind him. I knew you'd come here. A deep male voice cut through the air. James whipped around, his body tensing. Standing a few feet away was a man dressed in a dark suit, a scar running down his cheek. You shouldn't keep digging, Richard. The man smirked. Some truths are better left buried. James clenched his fists. Who the hell are you? The man stepped closer, his gaze sharp. Someone who protects the right interests. Then a knowing smile. Your brother won't be happy about this. James's blood ran cold. So Daniel's behind all of this. The man's smile widened. Don't underestimate him. You have no idea what he's willing to do to protect what's his. James didn't flinch. He simply stared the man down, memorizing his face, his every detail. Then, without another word, he got into his car and started the engine. As he drove back to the hotel, one terrifying certainty filled his mind. If Daniel was involved, then Jessica's accident wasn't an accident at all, which meant his wife had never died. And now, James was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. James gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove back to the hotel. His mind was still trapped in the nun's words, in the worn-out note that was now in his pocket, and in the stranger's threat outside the orphanage. None of this was a coincidence. Victoria had been abandoned right after Jessica's accident. His brother Daniel was involved. And now someone was watching him. He pulled into the hotel's parking lot, but his senses remained on high alert. He was used to maneuvering through the ruthless world of business where betrayal was commonplace. But this was different. This wasn't about money or power. This was his life, his past, his family. As soon as he entered his suite, he pulled out his phone and dialed. "Tell me you have something," he ordered without preamble. The investigator's voice was tense. "Not just something, Mr. Richard. We have everything. Your brother Daniel is more involved than we imagined, and we have proof." A cold chill ran down James's spine. He walked over to the window, staring at the city lights. "Tell me everything." "First, we have confirmation that Jessica never died in the accident." The investigator's words hit like a hammer to his chest. "The medical records were falsified. The body you buried, it was never properly examined." James's throat tightened painfully. Then whose body was it? The investigator hesitated. A woman of similar physical characteristics, but her identity was never revealed. What's clear is that it was all a setup, a perfectly staged deception. James shut his eyes, his hands curling into fists. For 10 years, he had mourned his wife. For 10 years, he had believed that her life had ended in that accident. But now, the truth crashed down on him like a brutal storm. Jessica had never been in that coffin. He leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. "Daniel, what does he have to do with this?" The investigator paused before answering. He was the one who handled everything after the accident. He ensured the case was closed quickly, that no further questions were asked. "And then, we tracked Victoria back to a private hospital where she was admitted as a baby." James's heart pounded violently. "And?" The investigator's voice was grim. "That hospital belonged to Daniel Richard." James felt his stomach tighten into a knot. Bastard. But the investigator wasn't done. And there's something worse. James's grip on his phone tightened. "We didn't find proof that Jessica died, but we did find evidence that she was held somewhere. For years." A heavy silence filled the air. Jessica had been alive all this time? Locked away, hidden from him. And their daughter? James's mind raced, piecing together the nightmare that had consumed his life for a decade. "I don't have more details yet," the investigator admitted. "But one thing is certain, Daniel didn't act alone. Someone else is behind this." A cold fury gripped James's chest. If Daniel had orchestrated all of this, if he had stolen his wife, his child, his entire life, he would pay. He hung up without another word, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. But before he could even move, his phone vibrated. An unknown number. He opened the message. "Stop digging into the past, James, or you'll end up buried with it." A rush of adrenaline shot through his veins. Whoever was behind this, they were watching him. They knew. James exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't stopping. He left his suite with purpose in his stride. Downstairs, in a hotel restaurant, he spotted her. Victoria. She was arranging tables, completely unaware of the storm she was caught in. He walked toward her, his heart pounding. "I need to talk to you." Victoria turned, surprised and wary. "About what?" James took a deep breath. "About your past. About who you really are." Her brows knitted together. "What?" "Your birth records. Your orphanage intake. The scar on your wrist. Everything points to something you haven't been told." Victoria let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You're a billionaire with too much free time, huh? I'm just a hotel worker. There's nothing special about me." James shook his head firmly. "You're not just anyone, Victoria. And neither am I. I'm sure our paths crossed long before you realize." She stared at him, part of her wanting to dismiss his words, but another part hesitated. Her lips parted as if she were about to say something, but then she stopped. Something shifted in her eyes. Something awoke. And suddenly, a flash of memory hit her. A burning car. A muffled scream in the darkness. A warm hand holding her tight as a woman's voice whispered, "You have to live, my love." Victoria staggered backward. James caught her before she could fall. Her wide, shaken eyes met his. I don't know." James's pulse raced. She was remembering something. But before he could press further, a shadow appeared in the restaurant's entrance. Daniel Richard, with that cold, calculated smile. James's body stiffened, his entire being pulsing with fury. "What a surprise seeing you here, brother." Daniel's voice was laced with amusement. "Didn't think you'd be so interested in a simple hotel maid." James held his gaze, his voice low and sharp. "What did you do to Jessica?" Daniel arched a brow, feigning surprise. "Jessica? Interesting that you're still thinking about her after 10 years. Didn't anyone teach you to let the past go?" James stepped forward, his eyes burning with rage. "If I find out you had anything to do with her disappearance, I will destroy you." Daniel chuckled, his eyes flashing with something dark. "Oh, James, you think you're invincible, but in this game, I hold all the cards." Victoria watched them both, confusion and unease filling her chest. But deep inside, something stirred. A terrifying feeling. Like Daniel was a danger she had known before, but had long forgotten. James knew it. He was too close to the truth. And now, the war with his brother was inevitable. James didn't take his eyes off Daniel. The venom in his brother's smile burned like a thorn under his skin. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight, but he couldn't lose control. Not yet. Daniel had answers, and James was willing to rip them out of him, even if it meant destroying him in the process. "You still blame me for everything, James. So predictable." Daniel sighed theatrically, adjusting his suit with practiced ease. "I thought that after 10 years, you would have learned. Some truths are better left buried." Fury burned in James's throat, a scream threatening to break free. "I won't rest until I know what you did to Jessica. And this time, your money won't protect you." Daniel let out a low, almost amused chuckle. "Ah, brother, so naive. You think this is all about you. But you're not the only player on this board." Before James could reply, a sharp, feminine voice cut through the air. "Finally, we're getting to the interesting part." Martina Mendez. She walked into the hotel lobby like she owned the place, her heels clicking with quiet authority. In one hand, she held a thick envelope. In the other, a cigarette, which she extinguished against a nearby ashtray with deliberate ease. "What the hell do you want now?" James snapped, his patience razor thin. Martina smirked, savoring the moment like a predator toying with its prey. "I'm here to offer you a choice, James. One that could save you a lot of pain or ensure everything crumbles around you." With a slow, calculated movement, she placed the envelope on the table. Inside is information you need. Something that will change everything you think you know. About Jessica, about Victoria, and about yourself. A cold wave of distrust spread through James's chest. He knew Martina was just as twisted as Daniel. If she was offering something, she wanted something in return. "What's the price?" he asked, his voice sharp. Martina crossed her arms and leaned in slightly. "I want Victoria." The silence that followed was suffocating. James felt the air grow thick, heavy. His jaw clenched. "Why?" Martina tilted her head, her smirk deepening. "Because someone else wants her. Someone who has been waiting for this moment for a very long time." A sharp pulse of alarm shot through James's chest. "Who?" Martina laughed softly, cruelly. "Now, that's the real question, isn't it?" She picked up the envelope and tapped it against the table. "But tell me, James, how much are you willing to risk for the truth?" James grabbed the envelope with caution and ripped it open. Inside, old photographs, altered documents, and a handwritten letter with a name that made his blood run cold. Jessica Richard, his wife. His heart pounded violently as his eyes moved over the familiar handwriting. A farewell letter. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't escape." James's hands curled into fists. "What kind of sick joke is this?" he growled. Martina raised an amused brow, enjoying his reaction. "It's not a joke. It's proof that Jessica never died in that accident. She was separated from her daughter, kept against her will, erased from existence." The room spun around him. His worst fear was true. Jessica had been alive. Martina stepped closer, her voice a whisper against his ear. "Victoria isn't the only piece in this game, James. Jessica is still in it too, and I know where she is." Rage, desperation, hope, all exploded inside him at once. "If you know where Jessica is, tell me. Now." Martina smiled, slow and cruel. "It's not that simple, but I can take you to her, if you give me Victoria." A chill ran down James's spine. No, he wasn't trading his daughter. But Jessica was alive. He turned to Daniel, who had been watching in silence, a smug grin playing on his lips. "What do you have to say about this?" Daniel shrugged. "Don't look at me. I'm just enjoying the show." James's teeth ground together. Daniel relished seeing him suffer. Martina was playing with him. But if there was even the slightest chance that Jessica was alive, he had to take it. He exhaled sharply and met Martina's gaze. "I'm not making a deal with you, but I will find out the truth on my own." Martina let out a soft, mocking laugh. "Oh, James, you think you have control? How adorable." She took a slow step back, lighting another cigarette. "Fine. You won't accept my offer. Then I'll play my final card." She pulled out her phone. James's body tensed. Martina dialed a number and brought the phone to her ear. A few seconds passed, and then she smiled devilishly. "Hello, darling. It's me. He's here. Do you want to talk to him?" James's blood turned to ice. Martina extended the phone toward him, and on the other end, a trembling voice shattered his world. "James." His lungs stopped working. His vision blurred. His grip on reality crumbled, because he knew that voice. It was Jessica. James felt the world collapsing around him. The sound of Jessica's voice through the phone was like a punch to the chest, a stabbing mix of disbelief and desperation. 10 years believing she was dead. 10 years of emptiness and pain that had turned him into a cold, ruthless man. But now, his wife was there, on the other end of a line, alive. "Jessica." His voice came out ragged, a whisper heavy with emotions barely contained. But before he could get an answer, Martina snatched the phone from his hand and ended the call with a venomous smile. Well, you've had enough for today. You wouldn't want all this excitement to cloud your judgment, would you?" James took a furious step toward her, but Martina raised a hand calmly. "If you really want to see her again, you'll have to do things my way." The billionaire felt his blood boil. He had come too far to keep playing by someone else's rules. "I don't have time for your games, Martina," he growled, fists clenched. "Tell me where Jessica is." Martina let out a soft, amused laugh, as if savoring his desperation. "Why would I do that for free?" Her eyes glowed with mockery. "If you really want her, you'll have to give me Victoria. It's a simple trade." James stared at her with pure hatred. He wasn't about to let his daughter fall into Martina's hands. Not now that he had finally found her. "You have no power over me, Martina," he said coldly. "And if you think you can manipulate me, you're making the worst mistake of your life." Martina raised an eyebrow and stepped closer, reducing the space between them. "Oh, then tell me, James, how exactly do you plan to find Jessica without my help?" James smirked, and in that instant, Martina realized her mistake. She had underestimated him. Without warning, the lobby doors burst open, and 3 security agents moved in with swift precision. Behind them, a man in a dark suit entered, holding a thick folder. "James's private investigator. Mr. Richard," the man said firmly. "We have the exact location of Jessica Richard. And we also have proof that your brother Daniel and Miss Mendez were responsible for keeping her hidden all these years." For the first time, Martina lost her composure. Her confident smirk vanished instantly. "That's impossible." James snatched the folder from the investigator's hands and flipped it open. Documents, medical records. It was all there. Jessica had been taken to a private clinic outside the city. Sedated, isolated for years. A hospital funded by a shell corporation owned by Daniel Richard. The billionaire shut the folder with a sharp snap and turned to his brother, who stood in tense silence, his jaw locked tight. "Nothing to say, Daniel." Daniel exhaled and shrugged. "Jessica always favored you. You were always the perfect son. I just did what was necessary." James felt the overwhelming urge to hit him, to break him where he stood. But he wouldn't dirty his hands with someone like Daniel. Instead, he turned to his security team. "Take him. Let the lawyers handle the rest." Daniel tried to resist, but the guards grabbed him with iron grips. "You can't do this to me, James," he spat, rage twisting his face. "I'm your brother." James leaned in slightly, his gaze sharp as steel. "You lost the right to call yourself my brother the day you stole everything from my family." Daniel was dragged away, still shouting until his voice faded in the distance. Martina, still in shock, took a step back. "James, we can talk, we can negotiate." But he had no interest in listening. "Do you know the difference between you and me, Martina?" His voice was dangerously low. "You play with power. I am power." He signaled to the guards, and Martina was escorted out of the hotel. Her fate was sealed. But James didn't stay to watch it unfold. He had only one goal: Jessica. The drive to the clinic was the longest of his life. Every minute stretched into an eternity, every second a torment. When he finally arrived, he didn't wait for the guards to open the door. He jumped out of the car and strode inside without hesitation. The sterile scent of disinfectant and medicine hit him immediately. His footsteps echoed down the corridor as his heart pounded against his ribs. A nurse recognized him instantly. "Mr. Richard." "Where is Jessica?" he interrupted, too impatient for explanations. The woman nodded quickly and led him to a room at the end of the hallway. James took a deep breath before stepping inside. And there she was, Jessica. Her hair was longer, her skin paler, but it was her, his wife, his love, the woman who had been stolen from him 10 years ago. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time ceased to exist. "James." Her voice was weak, as if she were afraid this was all just a dream. He crossed the distance in 2 steps and pulled her into his arms. "I'm here, Jessica. I found you." Tears streamed down her face as she clung to him desperately. "I thought I'd never see you again." James closed his eyes, pressing his face into her hair. "I will never let you go again. I promise." Weeks later, Daniel and Martina were convicted of fraud, kidnapping, and identity manipulation. Their names were forever tainted, their power obliterated. Jessica recovered slowly, with James and Victoria by her side. For the first time in 10 years, their family was whole again. And as James watched his wife and daughter together, he understood something. He had spent a decade in darkness, consumed by pain and vengeance. But in the end, the love he thought was lost had found its way back to him. And this time, he would never let it slip away again. Thank you for listening to this incredible story until the end. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We also suggest watching the video that appears on the screen so you can discover other amazing stories. Because I guarantee you'll be surprised.